Great. So hi, everyone. My name is Shanti Besso. I'm the Director of Leadership and Community Building Programs at SFU Continuing Studies, including the Leadership Essentials Certificate Program. I'd like to start by acknowledging that I am joining you from the unceded traditional territories of the Coast Salish peoples, in particular the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh. There's a really great resource I've been using and sharing recently called native-land.ca, which is a really great way to learn about whose land you're on, and in particular in pandemic Zoom world, when people are often gathering together from so many different places. I really want to thank the team that I work with, and my colleagues Megan Fraser and Bernice Holden are on the call with us today, so you might hear from them in the chat box or responding to your questions. Some quick rules of engagement. We're going to keep everyone except the panelists muted for the session, but both the chat box and the question function are enabled, and we certainly encourage you to say hello, let us know where you're joining from, or post questions and reflections. And as I mentioned, the session's being recorded and chat will be saved. We will not tolerate abusive, racist, homophobic, or otherwise hateful comments. We're really committed to maintaining a safe space for all of us to learn together. I am so pleased to be moderating this amazing panel. We have a stellar team of leaders that we're going to learn with together today. I will keep my remarks very brief. Really, I just wanted to share a little bit of the context and the inspiration for this session. So when we started developing the Leadership Essentials Certificate Program, which was about a year and a half ago, part of what we wanted to do was sort of reframe the whole notion of leadership, to think about it as a suite of tools and practices that are really available to anyone, regardless of positional authority. We also really wanted to be intentional about threading a decolonizing lens throughout the work, and to give people tools to do this in a meaningful and practical way. And so when we were sort of brainstorming and being really generative, we were acting on our collective experience and expertise, and we had a hunch that we were onto something, but obviously no one could have predicted 2020 and the ways in which the intersecting global crises that we're facing so urgently require people in organizations and communities everywhere to embrace our roles as transformative leaders. But it's easier said than done, right? So in the face of all of this unrelenting uncertainty and change, how do we stay focused and lead others? And how can we prioritize decolonizing our leadership practices in the middle of a global economic crisis? How do we lead in this moment? So that's what we're here to reflect on together. We've got a wonderful group of panelists that are the curriculum developers and instructors for the Leadership Essentials Certificate. And they're going to share some reflections on these questions with us. The way that we've scheduled the panelists today corresponds with the arc of the certificate program. So we will start with Rain Daniels, who teaches a course called Essentials for Leading the Self. Next, we'll hear from Indy Bhatt, who teaches a course focused on teams and relationships. From there, we'll move to Parker Johnson, who leads a course focused on leading in organizations. And last, but certainly not least, we'll hear from Melanie Matining, who leads a course focused on equitable people practices. And I will give one shameless plug before I turn it over, which is that registration is open for all of the courses in the Leadership Essentials program. And so if after the session today, you're eager to learn more from these folks, we certainly welcome you to join any of their courses. I do want to share one slide, which is just what we're hoping that you'll come away with today. Figure this out. So we're really hoping that you come away with a sense of possibility and hope. We're hoping that all of us have a deeper understanding of the relationship between self and systems. We're hoping we all sort of increase our awareness of the ways in which systems of oppression impact our ability to lead. And then we also want to make a commitment to take one action to become more courageous in our leadership practices. So towards the end of the session, I'm going to invite all of you to share that action in the chat room. Stop share. So without further delay, I would like to move on to our panel. I know that if you're here, you already want to hear from these folks, so I'm not going to use our time reading extensive bios, but please know that they are all ridiculously impressive people, and I really encourage you to go to our website and learn more about each of them. Each panelist has 5 to 7 minutes, and we're going to leave as much time as we can for your questions and reflections at the end. Please feel free to put your questions into the question box as we go along, and we'll try to get to everyone. So Rain, can I please just turn it over to you, and we'll get going and let you open the session.
Thank you, Shanti. Yes, you can. Hi, everybody. Really nice to be here today. It's my pleasure to be here. My name is Rain Daniels. I am an Anishinaabe. I'm a member of the Saugeen Nation in Ontario, born in Kaikite territory, which is colonially known as New Westminster. And I live on the traditional and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. I hope everyone is well, or as well as can be. Full disclosure, I am scrolling through some notes here. I will try not to sound like I'm reading, but if it sounds like I am, I am. I mostly work in the area of Indigenous specific anti-racism for more than a few decades now. And I'm here today honored to sit with my colleagues in this leadership certificate program. And as Shanti alluded to, this is a very interesting time that we're all in. Systemic hardship, of course, is not new for many people. Ongoing political tensions, climate issues, land issues, structural violence, ongoing colonization. And now here we are, a little isolated from each other. And we're nearing the end of 2020. I know many people are pretty happy about that. And maybe that's a comment on some hopefulness for 2021. And we're entering winter. Winter solstice is just around the corner. So it is a deeply reflective time. And so on that note, I'm hearing more reflections and more intense questioning from people about how to move forward collectively and how to take care of each other. Of course, with these questions come other questions about social change and about just relations. Justice, just relations, and leadership is part of that. Although people have been working in social change efforts for years, decades, much longer than that, of course, as far back as we didn't call it social change. It was just living or resisting dominant or violent systemic forces. And we can all be grateful to those who have gone before us. But it's always an opportune time, always, to reassess and make inquiries of how to deepen social change. In part because while we all know there is change afoot, there is a lot of work to do. Many people do look to people who can lead, whether in social movements or in organizations. And so we need to make inquiries about leadership itself. What kind of leaders are needed? For people who want to be a leader or nurture leadership capacity within themselves, or explore leadership, what leadership means to them, asking themselves, why am I drawn to leadership? So that somebody is entering leadership fully conscious about why. Can leadership be found outside of positions of leadership? Can leadership be nurtured in everyone? How do you utilize the power afforded to you as a leader in a way that serves the greater good? How do you navigate a system that may not recognize you or legitimize you as a leader? How do you navigate spaces where some people are supported and others are under threat? What does care look like? What do ethics look like? How do systems adapt and shift to ensure that we have just relations? How can relations be built on principles of reciprocity, care, accountability, etc.? These are just a few questions that we are approaching in these courses that we hope to unearth. They are questions that connect the system with the self. An interest that we have in the course is about how to maintain a deeply critical lens and how to create substantive action, principle-based work, principles being the work, the action of enacting one's values. And what does that really look like? How do we shift from statements, commitments, reports, declarations to taking action in the day-to-day? How do we incorporate an understanding of ongoing colonization and how this has shaped structures and informed roles within structures? How has our socialization been informed by related ideologies, white supremacy, patriarchy, capitalism? These are no small questions. We need to interrogate and examine how we've been socialized and what we believe about leadership, what we've experienced as leaders in the past, or from leaders, both positive and negative, all of it. We need to be open to this opportunity to reshape what leadership looks like. We need to examine how structures have benefited us or not, have privileged us or not. Do the system rules align with our own code, our own ethics? How can a social justice lens be nurtured, sometimes within a system that is doing everything it can to resist a socially just lens? We need to interrogate ideologies, and we need to look at ourselves, what we've embodied, not just what we think, but what we've experienced, and what experiences do we want to be part of creating. This requires developing comfort in the uncomfortable and working with the tensions embodied in the translation of the change process. Too often, there are prescribed notions of what it is to be a leader. We hope to encourage a questioning of rote styles of leadership, a questioning of what serves us and what doesn't serve us anymore. I'll just give a really brief example. There might be a negative view of people gathering together in ways that lie outside the norm of communication in an organization. You might read an article that refers to this group gathering as colluding or gossiping or toxic, creating a toxic environment, and direct you to the idea that this is negative behavior in an organization. Whereas if we encouraged a critical view, we might question what is happening for the people involved. We might ask how power is functioning in the team or in the organization that results in people needing to gather to talk privately. What needs are getting met? Who are the people involved? Who has a voice, who does not? Who is under threat? Is the gathering together a means to a more liberatory experience for the people involved within a system that isn't recognizing their full voice, power, and agency, nor providing a space to take up issues in the organization or on the team? And how does a leader approach the situation with humility? That's a lot of questions. I do like asking questions, but my time has probably come to a close here for now. So just a few words and that little vignette to say that we want to support developing a critical muscle. We want people to question and to maintain a systems lens. So thank you for listening. And with that, I'll pass it over to Indy.
Thank you, Rain, and a warm welcome to you all. We're so thrilled to have so many of you joining us here today. My name is Indy Bott, and I use the pronouns she and her. I live in Vancouver and would like to respectfully acknowledge this land, the unceded and traditional territories of the Coast Salish peoples, specifically the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and the Musqueam First Nations. I live and work as a guest on this land, as a woman of color, cisgender, heterosexual, an immigrant, and a settler. So as we reflect back on 2020, much has been revealed about our world, about leadership, inequitable systems, oppression, toxic use of power, etc., and demonstrating a much needed shift in leadership, urging us to keep challenging and asking again and again, who belongs, who matters, who doesn't, who is a leader, what is leadership, how and what influences leadership, in service of who and for what purpose. Many of us, and I imagine many of you, have become aware of an urgent need for transformative change and a much needed culture shift within our organizations and teams. Social change activists have been advocating for this kind of change for a long time, as Rain also alluded to. I'd like to believe that more people are now ready for a new kind of leadership. As I prepared for today, I reflected on the language that emerged as we developed these courses, and in particular for the Teams course that I'll be facilitating. Before I share the words, I'd like to invite you into a brief reflective practice. As you listen to these words, reflect on what, if anything, shifts in your heart and your mind about leadership. Here are some of the words that emerged. Transformation, systems thinking, decolonization, healthy use of power, healthy conflict, liberation, relationships, belonging, caring. So take a moment to let these words sink in, and quietly and on your own, reflect on what comes up for you. In the Teams course, leaders are invited and guided to embracing a new level of consciousness for themselves and for the teams that they work with to meet the challenges and needs of the 21st century. In the time that we have, I'd like to highlight one idea from the course, and that is of liberatory consciousness. So what does that mean? Let me explain by first acknowledging that many of us are experiencing a tension between the awareness and a sense of urgency for transformative change, while simultaneously experiencing being immersed in a dominant, oppressive system that holds us back, keeps us stuck in toxic and oppressive systems. So how do we navigate this tension? The daily struggle of critiquing, challenging, and dismantling while living and experiencing that same system that we're critiquing, challenging, and dismantling. So liberatory consciousness is a four-step process of awareness, analysis, action, and allyship and accountability. So in increasing our awareness, we're naming, recognizing, and noticing what's happening in the world around us, especially what's not working. And then taking time for analysis to interrogate what we see happening and inquiring why inequities continue to exist. And based on taking the time that it takes and the deep analysis, taking action and identifying where we can be most influential. Allyship and accountability then refers to identifying how we support each other and continuing to ask how to be most helpful and to ensure no harm is done. Liberatory consciousness then enables us to live our lives within oppressive systems and institutions with an awareness and intentionality. So we'll get more into that in the course. But in general, in the course, we make visible aspects of leadership that we've accepted and normalized. We critique and name the colonial, patriarchal, and white supremacist ideologies that keep us stuck in outdated and oppressive forms of leadership. We consistently acknowledge various forms of tension. We dialogue around the challenges. We explore alternatives. We experiment with adaptive approaches, and we integrate social justice ideologies. We unpack socialization, identity, internalized oppression, and complicity in white supremacy. We challenge oppressive systems and how power is being used, asking who has a voice, who doesn't, to ask why some voices are dismissed, silenced, or deemed disruptive, to question who determines the norm, the standards, and the expectations for how teams function, and to ask where are the voices, perspectives, and contributions of Indigenous, Black, and people of color. We also explore psychological safety and its influence on ethics, equity, communication, conflict, belonging, etc. So we question racism and oppression from a different angle, not from a diversity and inclusion perspective, but from a decolonized perspective, which challenges and resists white supremacist ideologies. So learners in this program will be provided with structure, space, and support for critical analysis that will stretch you beyond your socialized conditioned mindset into a creative tension of change and conflict, to step into transformative change and healthy conflict. You will explore and put into practice language like liberation, relational leadership, caring mindsets, healthy conflict, deep democracy, etc. You will have an opportunity to do something unique, to share your leadership with to shape your leadership with a new perspective from new angles. So this program gives me hope for a liberatory form of leadership where we all belong, where we can lead ourselves and our teams through impossible times. So to wrap up, I'd like to share a quote by John A. Powell. Belonging is an expression of caring, one that shifts our attention away from an individualistic to a more collectivist mindset. It supports the fact that the human condition is about belonging, that we simply cannot thrive unless we are in relationship. Thank you, and I'm now going to pass it over to Parker.
Thank you very much. And excuse me, recovering from a little bit of a cold, not COVID, cold. So it's really an honor to be here. And yeah, I can't say enough how honored I am to be on this team and be working with my esteemed colleagues. And I'm glad that you have taken the time to be here with us today as well. I am also coming to you from these unceded, occupied, and stolen lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. And the accent you hear, I'm originally from the States, was born on Wampanoag territory and lands near a place known as Boston. And the work that informs at least my perspective on this comes from having been here since 2002. And also being the descendant of stolen people on these stolen lands, which does very much inform the ways in which I move in the world. It's also informed by patriarchy and the privileges that come with occupying a cis male hetero body and moving through this space. Although I must admit, in my 60 years on this planet, this body is starting to shift in ways that just trying to, as we say, move forward. But enough with that. Yeah, recognizing and locating ourselves is always so important in terms of the spaces that we occupy and the work that we do. My interest always is, particularly in these times of global uprising and unrest, where the struggles for things such as land back, Black Lives Matter, Me Too, missing murdered Indigenous women, and so many other transformative and liberatory work that's happening, trans inclusion, and having worked at the city of Vancouver for 10 years, learned quite a bit about how organizations operate. And prior to that, working at the University of British Columbia. So getting a bit of a sense of a Canadian context. My interest in particular around organizational work is really around organizational transformation. And in order to really understand that, we have to understand the origins of our notions of the idea of organizations and where things come from to really understand how we got here today. So there will be an opportunity for us to, as my colleagues have already spoken about, to interrogate these things and to really interrogate the role of the organization, not so much always in terms of the role of people serving the organization, but how does the organization not only serve the people, but the community and the planet and all our relations as we move through this world. So I guess I have quite a few notes here. It's really to look at this also from the notion of organization as a source for us to rehumanize ourselves and also to operate in ways that enhance the quality of life, not only for humans, but also our responsibilities as stewards in the context of not only organization, but this place that we're operating in. And in that sense, also the notion around organizational emotional intelligence, because oftentimes we talk about emotional intelligence as an individual thing, but organizations too have responsibilities, not only to the oftentimes what people refer to as shareholders when they're talking about businesses, but more specifically to the people who inhabit those organizations. And so who gets invited in? Under what conditions are they invited in? And really to explore the ways in which organizations also are seen as products for assimilation. We see how assimilation is already oftentimes embedded in an organization. Will you fit in the organization? And the ways in which people have to often contort their true selves to fit in places that are often hostile to their existence. And we're designed to exclude them. And so for us, it's really how do we transform these organizations? How do we toggle and work with the resistance that comes with those changes? And in doing that change, what are not only the values, vision, and mission for the organization, but how do we transform the culture? And what kind of work do we need to do in order to make those changes? Because oftentimes organizations will speak to the importance of policies and practices and vision and values. And all those things certainly are very important. But we also need to interrogate what are the cultural norms? What is the hidden curriculum of the ways in which we operate? How do we bring people in? How do we keep them? And how do we also push them out? So what are our duties and responsibilities? Oftentimes, too, within the context of organizations, people look at risk mitigation. And what I want to encourage folks to do is to move away from the conversation around safety and security of the organization in terms of its sort of legal obligations, if you will, but really to look at what are its obligations in terms of its larger role within the context of humankind and our notions around liberation, transformation, and accountability. And if we're going to decolonize, we have to be able to acknowledge the ways in which our organizations do harm. So a large part of the work around organizational change is around harm reduction, transformation, and liberation. And so the connectedness, the ways in which we will look at things such as no longer talking about our duty to accommodate, but our commitment to include. How do we create these notions of belonging? What do we do to dismantle and disrupt some of the ways in which patriarchy, capitalism, and white supremacy and colonialism continue to dominate the ways in which we operate and the ways in which we think and how we are complicit in those things? So as we shed this, and it's this ongoing daily work, we need to look at how do we explore, for example, questions to talk about assessing our organizations around these things. And what are the questions that we need to ask? What does it look like around decision-making that is decolonized and is transformative? What does it mean when we're having organizational learning and we have organizations that are designed for learning purposes, not just for quote unquote bottom line purposes? And as we enhance our ability to operate within these organizations and look at what does it mean to lead an organization in a way, that is transformative and liberatory, that also speaks to who we are and the values that we hold. So again, it's really an opportunity for people to explore and examine the ways in which we navigate with power. We look at issues around equity and more importantly around justice. And how do we effectively decolonize not just the organizations, but the ways in which that is reflected in our own values, beliefs, and our complicity. So, I think for me, this is a great opportunity to learn with you and for us to explore and travel through these intellectual terrains in meaningful ways. There was a recent workshop that I attended where the workshop presenter asked a question, and he said, given all that's been happening out here in the world and some of the ways in which we have seen the horrors of injustice visited upon people and on our TV screens, on our mobile devices, computers, what have you. He said, I oftentimes will ask an organization, what would you do if in your parking lot, in your structure, someone was killed, say by the police or through some other means that wasn't necessarily a member of your organization, wasn't an employee, but this tragedy happened on your land, on the property that you have responsibility for? How would you respond to that the next day? What kind of capacity do you have to address that? And invariably, oftentimes, he said that organizations would say, we would just keep on doing our work. We would travel on, and because we have work to do. And so when these things happen, and they are happening, what is our responsibility as an organization to the communities in which we find ourselves, to the people in our organizations, and the ways in which care is expressed? So again, we have to look at what's the relationship between who we think we are and how we actually behave. Thank you.
Thanks, Parker. I want to thank all three of my colleagues for creating a solid foundation in describing, I think, a bit about what our program is, and especially also the lens that we're taking on this. I feel like all three of you have definitely covered a lot of what I was already going to say. So, and I think that that's great. I also want to mention as well, just in terms of that, is that this program that we are going to be putting forth, and generally just the way that we've been working, has been done in a way that's centered around collaborative thinking, especially in understanding what it looks like to create these equitable, diverse, and inclusive practices. And I think that that's something that you guys will all very, very much see in our conversations that we have with you today. We have a very, very solid and solid foundation that's going to be guiding all of the courses in course 1, 2, 3, and 4 in our understanding of what a thriving leadership and a thriving organization can look like. My name is Melanie McDeening. I'm also meeting you today on the unceded and ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. I'm a settler on this land by way of the Philippines. My family came here in 1990. I am a queer woman of color, and I use these lenses as a way to make way for the voices and experiences that are often invisibilized in conversations, particularly in human resource management, which is, hi Ben, Philippines, which is the course that I'm going to be leading up. So I wanted to give a bit of a description on what the course is going to be about, and also some of my reflections around it as well too. So the course is going to be an exploration of relationship-centered people practices. Right now, there's a lot of attention on diversity as a key focus to EDI, equity, diversity, and inclusion. However, I think it's important to really break down these terms and provide a deeper and more meaningful understanding of diversity, particularly. All three have already gone deeper into the systems of power. But I think being able to go deeper into what diversity means, particularly in that diversity is an outcome to what happens when leaders create equitable and inclusive practices in the workplace. It can be really harmful for organizations to solely focus on bringing in diversity for understanding individuals as diverse. Diversity is more of a relational attribute to an organization rather than just an individual's characteristics. And I think when we're able to identify that, we can prevent the replication of tokenism, microaggressions, and also exposure to harm, specifically towards systemically marginalized people. So this course begins first with talking about how oppressive systems of power historically, systemically, and persistently have shaped management practices that reduce humans to just resources, particularly in how global colonial capitalist economies were made way through the industrialization, particularly of enslavement of Black people, the displacement of the indigenous peoples, and also the exploitation of natural resources. And ways we also want to bring in ways we can stop and recognize and center practices that actively dismantle these oppressive systems. So this course focuses on recognizing the toxicity of control and really shifting towards the engagement of practices which inherently ask us as leaders to cede power to employees and center relational, equitable, and inclusive people practices. I think that one thing that I really enjoy doing in a cheeky and not so cheeky way is making sure that hiring practices are actually at the very end of the curriculum rather than just the beginning, because I know that in order to be able to really create a solid foundation and create and cultivate and nurture a thriving workplace, that's something that we have to do first. I want to echo some of the things also that Parker mentioned as well that I think will be really, really important throughout these conversations, is particularly the conversation around risk management or risk mitigation. I think that that's a really, really interesting, it plays a really, really interesting role in how leaders and organizations and even emerging leaders understand what our responsibilities are for EDI work, in the way that when we talk about risks and what EDI looks like, you really need to take a step into what risk taking is. And oftentimes what we see in organizations is that it ends up being mostly about liability and more of compliance towards systems that are oppressive. And so what we're wanting to do is really be able to dismantle that and find ways where we can create sustainability within each other as a workplace community, and also sustainability within our ecosystems, within our industries, to be able to really champion what EDI looks like, equity, diversity, and inclusion is what EDI is. What we can do as leaders to be able to create these thriving spaces. So I'll just leave it at that because I know that we're also going to be going into conversations with everyone. I'm excited to see what some of the questions are. So I'll throw it back to Shanti.
Thank you, everybody. I'm a little new to Zoom webinar, so I'm gonna pop in here. Thank you so much. Really, it's just such a rich site for discussion, really. There are some questions that are starting to come up in the question box, and I want to invite others to start to pose questions and also reflections, and we'll just hopefully get into a wonderful conversation with all of you. Because there are so many on the call, I'm not going to play around with unmuting folks, but I'll read out your questions. So maybe I'll start with Shahira's questions. Shahira, if you don't mind, I will sort of put your two questions together. So starting out with a question about what about when the leadership in public sector service providers don't have or receive the necessary training and support to be the quote unquote inclusive organization in support of reconciliation that they boast that they are. And then Shahira is also posing another question about what is quite a different question actually, but I'll read it and then maybe we can get to both. What can you do when your leadership doesn't handle conflict well or is uncomfortable being uncomfortable and that contributes to the culture and capacity of the organization? Does anyone want to dive in?
Good questions. Really good questions. I'll just make one or two comments. So a leader not being supported to lead an organization with quote inclusive organization and support of reconciliation, it's really common. I mean, this is really a question that cuts to the crux of what we're talking about. So many organizations have policies or statements on being inclusive or being diverse or being equitable, or decolonization and indigenization and reconciliation are also three words that are becoming more and more used in organizational statements. And through my work and through discussions and witnessing behavior, I see that many people have a lot of confusion about what all of these terms mean in a real substantive way. And I think what we're trying to say is a leader needs to not be in a position that it's all on their shoulders too, as a leader. That's, you know, Parker was talking about people sometimes are pushed out. The expectations on the individual to create all of this change is part of what we're trying to disrupt. That it has to be a systemic and collective effort. So part of a leader's role is to, in my opinion, is to give voice to that effort. If that's not already part of somebody's ethic, collective work, then they might bump up into taking maybe too much on. There's so many layers to this question, so that's all I'll say for now and pass it over to Parker, Indy, and Mel.
Yeah, I guess in responding to this as well, I think that one of the things that leaders oftentimes find is that they have to often look at what protecting the organization as opposed to serving the people, and that's one of the things that, at least in my observation and experience, often can get in the way of where people feel their sense of responsibility and accountability is. And so organizational values and principles really, and that's part of what also we're going to be talking about very much in this. And someone mentioned here the importance of persons with disabilities. And so when I mentioned too about the commitment to include as opposed to the duty to accommodate, it really does have to do with organizations making commitments all across the board to really supporting everyone, including leaders and managers, and supporting people through mistakes, but allowing people to make those to make the changes necessary and to learn how to deal with conflict, and also to know how to do what I would call responsible, respectful apology that really is meaningful in a way that speaks to transformation and change, not just a momentary, oops, I'm sorry. And so organizations need to be able to do that, not just individuals. So we'll talk about what does it mean, for example, we talk about truth and reconciliation. What does it mean for leaders to embrace notions around transforming and decolonizing and not merely doing the performative gestures, And so, these are, I'm sort of going outside of the lines of the question, but these are the things that are important, I think, for leaders to consider. Pass it on to Mel and Andy.
There's a bunch of really rich questions coming up, so maybe I'll move on to another one. There's a question in the question box and then a comment in the chat box that I think I'll kind of put together. So Loretta Mitchell is asking, psychological safety and duty to accommodate. How does the program address disability, manage or inclusive people practices? And how does the program address feminism or gender bias? And then David Roche made a really important point, I think, in the chat box, 2 points. But the point that I wanted to highlight is no mention of disabled people, and this is a bit chilling. And so I wanted to invite the panel to respond to those questions and comments.
Yeah, I see that there's a comment about tendency to be abstract and conceptual. For sure, this is a short time we have together. I totally own that I can be more conceptual, and part of my intention, that was intentional, because I think we have to zoom out and zoom in and zoom out and zoom in. And so within the space of the classroom, virtual classroom, we can unpack all of this, and it also relates to the other question. All of it is relevant. Gender bias, ability bias, homophobia, etc. All of it is relevant, and it's all interconnected. So apologies if we didn't convey that in the breadth of our collective comments, but that is where we're coming from.
And I think another thing to add to that too is that very much in the courses that we've created, it focuses not just on systemic and institutional, but also really on the interpersonal and personal. And I think what we're really trying to work on is kind of like, it is the idea of fractals, which I think, yes, it's another conceptual idea, and I apologize for that. But I think what we're trying to get at here is that there are patterns that exist at a systemic level, and that it's very, very important for us to also be able to include that into how we understand how to be in relationship with each other. So in taking the course, I think you'll also see that we have engagements where it's centered around ACT, which is applied critical thinking. And then we also have activities that are centered around care, which is more around practices of care in ways that we can be in relationship to each other. So it is, again, really, really hard, I think, to give an overarching description of what our program is and what our thoughts are without talking conceptually, but very, very much we are wanting to really get down to kind of the basics around how to be in relationship with others as well. And just to David's comment as well. Hi, David. Nice to see you in the chat box, and nice to hear that you're here. I think that that's really valid that you're mentioning that. And for me too, knowing that that's something that I need to personally add more, especially in the explanation of things, I think is really, really necessary as well. Because very, very much so when we talk about systems of power that are toxic, for example, we've talked about white supremacy, we've talked about racism. Those all happen also as a result of intersectional oppressions as well. So people living with disabilities who are women, people living with disabilities who are coming from different identities, those are all things that are also impacting everyone as well. And identities are definitely not siloed. And that is, that lens is something that we really, really want to be able to bring into the courses.
And I'll just say really quickly, most of it has been said, but when we think about white supremacy, that yes, we are talking about white privilege, but within that, it's a pretty narrow set of assumptions around who belongs and who matters and who's included. So despite the language of white supremacy, the way that we are offering and laying out the courses, it does allow space for unpacking all of those intersectionalities that have already been mentioned.
Thank you all. So I want to acknowledge that I am cherry picking a bit in the questions here, but I wanted to go to, well, it's from an anonymous attendee, but I find this tension really interesting in my own work, and it's about the balance of doing meaningful EDI and relational work, which is slower and qualitative, not quantitative, but funders are so driven by statistics and quantity. So how can organizations meaningfully shift EDI practices when we're all sort of built on this capitalist funding model, and people's employment is on the line, right? This is like a real thing. We need our jobs. Any reflections about that?
I jumped in on the last one, so I'm holding back.
Yeah.
How about maybe I'll tap someone. You all have your. What about you, Parker? What do you think about that question?
Well, it's funny that that particular question was asked. Recently was in communication with a friend of mine who's a doula, and it's focusing BIPOC doulas actually over in Victoria, and they have a collective, and they were bumping into the very problem of accessing funds because they don't want to fit within the sort of corporate colonial framework. And so it is a challenge, and they themselves are wanting to maintain their own authenticity, and they don't have a head of the organization, if you will. And so, you know, people are creating and living different ways of operating and organizing, and having to navigate through these systems to maintain the integrity of who they are and what they choose to do, even while interacting with systems that want them to be something that they aren't. And so I think creative exploration of how to navigate those systems is so important. And so, you know, I don't have a set answer, but I will say that there are folks who are out there who are doing that work. And part of the ways, at least for me, in which I want to talk about organizations is also to talk about not just organizations writ large, but also the ways in which collectives are navigating their ways in the world as well. And how does leadership show up when leadership is decentralized and doesn't fit the quote unquote traditional formation? So, yeah.
I think another thing that comes to mind too is that we can't do this work solo, and oftentimes it's, you know, we ask these questions and we think about it solely as how can we as an organization survive? How can we as an organization survive? Recognizing that this is also a cultural thing that's happening in terms of scarcity, and in terms of how it's structured. And so I think for me, what this brings up is the idea of really trying to dismantle the idea of competition with one another, and figuring out how we can create coalitions together to figure out what these solutions can look like as an ecosystem, rather than just within an organization.
Just add one quick comment that there's really no prescription, I think is sort of what I hear in Parker Mill's comments too. There's no prescription. And I hear really a depth of need in a lot of the questions posed right now. I really hear some really common threads. There's no easy answers. And I think it's the breadth of all the conversations about all of the content that's needed. And as, you know, collectivity, I think is essential. So it's really undoing and creating at the same time, creating new ways all at the same time, which creates, it can create a lot of tension, and people have different thresholds for that tension, and thresholds, and different systems and organizations have different thresholds as well. Who was it that said organizations are control and slow motion? I can't remember who said that. It was Patrick Wolf. So policy level change, which some of these questions are getting at, it's hard work. I was just in a conversation the other day when we saw clear inequity and clear impact on Indigenous people, and it was based in policy. But the organization just thought, no, this is just our policy. This is just what we do. But there was a clear discriminatory line in how Indigenous people could engage with that organization, that system, because of that policy. And so to then take change to that level, time, energy, hard work, and collectivity, and really rethinking at a very deep level, because the root of that policy is rooted in these ideologies that we just finished talking about. They're rooted in deep histories of structures being the same way for a long time.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'll just sort of throw out another question, like, are organizations thriving? Under what conditions? And so what is the expectation from higher up, and what's the impact on individuals and teams and organizations in general? What is the impact? If you think about burnout and stress, and are people productive? Is there a sense of presenteeism that people are there, but are they present? Are they working at their potential? And so if we unpack it further and challenge current practices, we get a different picture. And I acknowledge that it's difficult to see a different way when you're so in it. And so that's part of what the program does, is that we unpack and we reveal and we peel back the layers to see what's actually happening, and what is the actual impact that perhaps isn't visible to some.
Yeah. And also part of what we've been looking at also is we've been looking at, part of the question is maybe within a nonprofit sector, for example, how are the foundations and other entities that are distributing funds seeking to disrupt these colonial and corporate practices that are imbued within the system that they operate, that reinforce them, and then trouble organizations who are trying to get funding to do transformative and liberatory work, particularly for marginalized communities. And we're, in our work, trying to move the margins to the center and really frame that in some ways that will obviously disrupt the normal flow of business, if you will. And that's very intentional.
There's a quick question, Reid. I don't know if you can answer this, but someone's wondering if you could share the example without divulging. No, okay. No, sorry, Pam. So there were a couple of questions in here that I think really go to the core of what we're trying to do in the program, which is around how do you lead this kind of change without positional authority? And I'm just wondering if we can talk a little bit about that today. One is from somebody who's saying, I work in an organization that does have, or at least what seems to be recognized as a genuine commitment to dismantling systemic inequities, and yet as an employee, I'm constantly hitting walls and feeling like I have little power to manifest structural change because I'm not at the top of the organization, which is, I think, speaks to kind of a cognitive dissonance that often people feel. I've witnessed it in my own organization, where we have these sort of grandiose visions and public statements, and then working within, we bump up against the reality of the practices and policies. And then I just want to find the other one. That was, I think it was Sarah. Yeah, Sarah Ewan. So I identify as a leader / change agent in my organization, but one without decision-making power or authority to spend money. So I can only do so much. At times even, I wonder if my voice gets heard as a barking voice rather than a voice to listen to. And I'd love to hear the panelists' thoughts and suggestions for how to light a fire under the leaders who are the decision makers and hold the purse strings.
I can respond to that. You know, when we think about power, we in the program we challenge folks to think beyond the traditional notions of power, the sort of the top-down approach, and actually provide an overview of you know 6 or 8 or a dozen so different types of power, and that goes beyond just the positional authority kind of role of power. And so there's ways that we encourage folks to think about beyond the individual and what does it mean to come together as a collective and to show up differently. And so whether that's for us ourselves as individual leaders, but also then how do we support the teams, or how do we support policy development or challenge and provide alternative approaches to change. And so that's the transformation that we talk about, and it goes back to the relational leadership that I made reference to. So what does relationship look like? How do we connect with others so that there's a sense of collective power? If you think of the various forms of protests around the world, around various issues, those folks often don't have positional power, but it's them coming together to pull together around the issues and consider the impact that that's having. And even think of in 2020, what's the impact that the Black Lives Matter movement has had, especially in this field of social justice and challenging systemic racism, systemic oppression, so on. So I'll leave it there and pass it on to somebody else.
Mel?
Gonna say something and then it went away from my head. The first thing that popped up to mind was the idea of power only existing among executive level folks, which I think is a bit of a myth. As Indy mentioned, there's a lot of power that exists in the front lines. And with so many organizations and companies, that is how an organization is run. So I think when I think about social change, I really look at it through a lens of change management. There's a tool that's used in change management around sponsorship mapping, and it's understanding no matter where you are in terms of in relation to the change, it's being able to identify the people who are the champions, and really being able to identify the different roles that exist in the organizations, and really how to build those coalitions again and understand the different roles that exist and how to really wield a power that isn't power over, but power with, and doing it in a way where, you can create that power, but power through networking. So.
Yeah, and I think too, just one of the things for me that's really important is some of the stuff that's being done in critical management studies. It's really offering some interesting and insightful work. And also looking at issues around organizational justice and really working at what does it mean for an organization to be just and not just, how should we say, in the traditional sort of neoliberal sense, organizations are always seeking to be efficient.
Thanks all. I think this is an interesting comment and question right down at the most recent one in the question box, from somebody saying, I struggle with labels and finding them divisive. And I think in reading this comment and question, the word labels might be interchangeable with how we're thinking of identities. I think that's what this person is getting at, but I'll read it out. So it's become politically correct to identify our personal labels upon introduction, as if pointing out these particular attributes are the most important things to know about each other. In my role as a leader of a nationwide team operating virtually, There are people I lead that I have no idea what they look like or what their quote unquote labels might be. And I have found working with my label-less team members reveals more about character and virtues and makes it easier to support and connect with them on a human level. Is the current trend of leading with our labels meant to be a temporary tool to recognize and break down barriers so we can ultimately get to the humanity behind them? And someday the labels will be out of fashion.
I can start off this conversation. For me, it's really about power, to name and reveal identities and the various types of labels, to then question who has power, who doesn't, and how does that impact their participation, their contribution, or their voice. That is, I think for me, and I think I would say that for the course, we're really looking at, like ideally, yeah, would be great to focus on humanity. We're not, and I don't feel like we're there yet. I know that might be a provocative comment, but we're not there. And so right now we do live in a divisive context, and we do live in a divisive world. And so for us to critically analyze what that looks like, and who belongs, who doesn't belong, who is dismissed, who is not permitted, who doesn't have equitable access. And it does come down to identifying the different groups based on their social identities. And so the work has to, that work has to be integrated and revealed.
Yeah, I would have to agree with Indy in the way where I think that as an organization and as leaders, I think it's necessary to be able to understand context and understand your organization. I know that in talking about equity, diversity, and inclusion, one of the tools that's used is intersectionality, which is a term that's coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, who is a lawyer, and she's a scholar, and she's also a Black feminist. And it talks about being able to identify your social positioning based on identities, which will, as a result, impact the way that your lived experiences and access to opportunities are based on how you navigate the world. And I think with organizations as well, I'd like to invite them to also do organizational intersectional reflections as well, particularly not just particularly in understanding the relationship to power and influence. And in order to be able to understand their own personal relationship to power and influence, I think that also really requires them to understand the people that they're working with, the people that they're serving. I think at a relational level, I think it's also important as well, just particularly me as being a light-skinned woman of color, I know that I navigate the world through in a very, very different way as someone who might have darker skin than me. And I think that for me, in terms of relationship building and understanding my own accountability and responsibility, I think that those are really, really important ways to be in relationship with people. But no doubt the idea of really understanding people at a human level is obviously so important as well. But I would agree with Indy that right now, especially with where the world is, the climate, I think that we need to work harder in being able to acknowledge and to be able to validate the struggles that exist among people and among communities.
Parker?
I just agree and would echo and amplify what has already been said. I do think that working with a sense of humility, courage, openness, and vulnerability and connectedness is so important. And recognizing our power and social location as we interact with folks, and the multiple layers and ways in which those things express themselves consciously and unconsciously in our dynamics. And that's very true also for organizations. So, having an intersectional lens at how we assess our organizational impacts. What is the data? What are the questions we want to ask to talk about our evolution, our change, our development, our growth? Because, for example, within the context of COVID, our health organizations are ill-equipped to really do any really in-depth intersectional analysis of what's happening and who's it happening to. And so we need to be able to ask the questions that will get us the answers that will be useful, as opposed to asking the questions we've always asked. It's kind of like people want a just recovery because they don't want to go back to quote unquote normal, because normal was harmful.
Yeah, thanks everyone. I really got a lot from what you said, Parker and Indy and Mel. And I just want to add a quick comment that as I'm thinking about this question, what comes to my mind is actually the land acknowledgement, because I see a connection in terms of, certainly what I read in this question is definitely people can be recalling or stating who they are because they feel like it's an expectation, or in other words, there's not a connection to the purpose. So I would take the question and ask, what's happening in that organization that is supporting, embodying the purpose, which is connected to what Mel, Parker, and Indy just finished saying about power, etc. So the land acknowledgement is very, very often said in a very rote way. And as an Indigenous person, for years, I witnessed the land acknowledgement being stated in a way that seemed kind of disembodied from either what was to come after the land acknowledgement, the event, or what was happening in that space, or it seemed that the person didn't have an embodied sense of why they were saying the land acknowledgement. I see a very strong connection and theme in this person's question and the land acknowledgement. So rather than dismiss labels, I don't consider them labels, but using the language from the question, rather than dismiss them, I would say go deeper. Why are we talking about this? I was in a space where their land acknowledgement was said for, somebody made a comment. It was great. This person was really brave and said, I have a question. We've been saying this land acknowledgement for 2 years. Can somebody tell me what this means? And I thought, how brave to say this, that they admitted they didn't really know why. And it opened up the conversation and hopefully supported a process, a discussion, a dialogue, and then an embodiment and connection to who the group was together as a collective and the space that they're in, and connected to their vision of change going forward. So really, really embodying it. So I would say go deeper with that whole topic with your group. Dig in.
Speaking of land acknowledgements, I know John O'Flynn asked a question and then reminded me that he had asked a question. So I wanted to read out his question, and then I was hoping that maybe as a last sort of reflection, we could go to this question about possibility as opposed to impossibility. But first up was John's question, which was, when a person uses the word stolen in their sharing about one's place here in BC, is it a term used more so in Western Canada, or is it commonly used by others throughout the country? Do folks have a sense of that? I don't actually know if that's more common in British Columbia.
Yeah, I guess it depends on who's referring to the land also. And I wouldn't be able to make a statement about East and West, but it is all stolen land, regardless of where you are, including treaty territory. And that might seem like a provocative statement, but the way that treaties are understood by Indigenous people and by non-Indigenous people is different. And the way that treaties, the intent of the treaties, and then how treaties have been enacted are two different things. So, but in terms of the question, Western Canada or throughout the country, I couldn't comment.
I also feel like I can't comment.
Yeah, and I'm not sure either. I do remember being at a conference once, and there was a speaker from Squamish Nation and then a speaker from Treaty 6, and the man from Squamish Nation said something about the unceded territories, and the man from Treaty 6 gave a really beautiful explanation of like you talk about unceded, but none of this land is unceded. Like we don't even I mean, we say that, but just because we have a treaty doesn't mean that we ceded our lands. Yeah. Are you guys up for turning to this question about the possible? How do we make people feel like there's possibility in leading in these times and dealing with these very, very complex and really urgent issues?
Maybe I can
It's a
start.
great question.
Or you can start.
Yeah, I think this is going to be more of a dialogue between all of us. I'm just sensing that. Yeah, I personally feel like we have to step into possibility. You know, what's the alternative? You know, that sense of despair and hopelessness. And, you know, I don't know about everybody else, but I know there are times where I do go into that place of despair and hopelessness and, you know, impossibility. And, but I also believe in the power of the collective, that if we come together, if we challenge the current mindsets, the current systems, there's so much possible. And, you know, to have hope, to shift how we work, how we connect, you know, what the dynamics are between us, how we treat each other. You know, I use some of the words when I was speaking, you know, around caring and belonging and connecting and sense of relationship with each other. I think that's what we need to step into in order to step into more possibility.
I think for me, the idea of possibility, it goes along with also the language of hope, which is very future tense, very, very future tense, it seems like for me. But I think one thing that kind of makes me feel like there's such a distance there is the overwhelm, I think, that happens with the idea of when I think just the idea of possibility. Because I think a lot of people think about possibility as very transformative change, which is most certainly what we need. And I think also another thing that's been really helpful for me is to really kind of break down different types of change, and to understand scales of change as well. So a lot of organizations that I work with, you know, especially in wanting to talk about equity, diversity, and inclusion, they mention we need to go through change. We need to go through transformational change, transformative change. Can you tell us how to do it? Do you have like maybe just, you know, out of the box structure that we could maybe work with? And my response is always no, because transformative change does not have shape. And the tools that we have aren't necessarily for saying, here's what it looks like, but the tools we have are tools of engagement, and that's working with each other. So when we're able to kind of break it down into bite-sized pieces and understand that it is something that's going to be collaborative, I think that that's something that helps me feel closer to possibility. And to also understand too that so much of that possibility again comes with relationships and small ways that we can make those changes, even if it's just, and I will say that I have a very hard time doing this just because right where we're living right now, there's a lot of anxiety, but just the idea of, you know, checking in or something like that, building those relationships, I think really brings us closer to possibility.
Well, I'll just share a very brief comment, and that is, in my experience, naming the unnameable, naming the hard stuff, naming, you know, the proverbial, the statement, elephant in the room, or naming what's under the rug, or what's been swept under the carpet. All of these issues that we've been talking about are painful. They involve pain and discomfort. And I don't know another way to get to hope and possibility outside of through the door of feeling and, you know, really feeling that difficulty in connection with other people. When I've been in spaces where somebody has named something that we all kind of knew, but nobody was saying it, what a sense of relief. I mean, it was difficult because now it was out there and now we had to look at it because it's not just naming, it's a lot more. It's all the work after you name it. But we have to be able to speak to each other about truth.
Really powerful. And yeah, yeah, thanks, the three of you. And yeah, I think exactly what Rain just said, you know, if we don't look at things not only outside of ourselves, but within ourselves, um, then what can we really do in terms of exploration and change? And when Melanie was saying, you know, people want it in a box, you know, how do we do this change real quick? For me, the hope lies in the collective work. You know, it lies in the work that's going inside and outside. You know, when I work with organizations, I'm coming in and I'm leaving. There are people who live there and stay there. And my duty is really to them and to support them in the best way I can. And also knowing that they're also part of the community. And I mean, we're all interrelated. And so my hope comes from those who came before. And, you know, it's those obligations and responsibilities um, to the ancestors, to this moment, and to those who will follow, that really informs me and inspires me. And so when I see folks out in the street and when I see folks in the organizations pushing hard, um, that I find inspirational. And it's also an invitation to continually to do our work. And when someone challenges me and says, you know, you did this and this is how it impacted me, I need to be accountable because the change is it's learning and unlearning all the time. Thank you.
And I'll just add one more thing. You know, I alluded to healthy conflict, and we've been talking about tensions, and that's part of the skill. That's one of the many, many skills and strategies we talk about. And what everybody's already mentioned is, you know, for us to be able to name these things and to step into and get comfortable with discomfort, because that's you know, that's where the transformation happens. And you know, none of this change happens easily. We have to step into what is difficult to get through to the other side. And that comes with, you know, a sense of relationship with each other, being in community with each other, having that dialogue, even when it's most difficult. And the idea of deep democracy, which is touched on in some of the courses, does just that. It's like, let's name it, let's put it out on the table, and then work with that.
Can't unsee what we've seen.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you all so much. There are so many great questions, and I'm sad that we're not going to get to all of them. And I really apologize to those of you who we didn't have time for, but I hope that you found this discussion and conversation as rich as I did. I am going to take a moment and invite people to just reflect for all of us on one commitment to an action that you want to take to make your leadership practice more courageous. And so I'm going to invite us all to sit in silence on Zoom for 2 minutes. And then I'd love it if people feel comfortable or are so inspired, if you want to share in the chat box so that everybody can see. And we can move this all forward together. Thanks, everyone. I can see that some folks are starting to Felicia, is the meeting over? I was just inviting people to take a moment to reflect on one action that you want to take to make your leadership practice more courageous going forward. And yes, with that, the meeting is over. And really just so much thanks and gratitude to Rain, Indy, Melanie, and Parker for taking the time with us today. Really, really appreciate it. And thanks to everybody who attended. It's wonderful that you were able to make some time to share and reflect. It's a real sort of privilege to have this kind of reflective space together. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.